Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Human Rights Magazine. What do we mean by homelessness? How many people are considered to be homeless? The United Nations Commission on Human Rights estimates that there are more than 100 million people in the world who are homeless, that is to say, people with no housing at all. In this episode of Human Rights Magazine, Florina Lupu examines the situation of homelessness here in Montreal, the home city of the Upstream Journal and this podcast, in the context of the COVID pandemic, and with her guests, she explores how the pandemic has changed political responses to homelessness.
Hello and welcome everyone. On this episode of the Upstream Journal podcast, we will be discussing the issue of homelessness in Montreal. We will be joined by three guests today. The first one will be Leilani Farah, who used to work as the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing between 2014 and 2020, and since 2020 has worked at The Shift, which is the organization that she has founded. Secondly, we'll be speaking to James Hughes, who is the president and CEO of Montreal-based organization The Old Brewery Mission. And last but not least, we will be speaking to Cécile Arbeau, who is the executive director of Dans la Rue, which is another Montreal-based organization dealing with the issue of homelessness, specifically referring to youth.
Although the issue of homelessness is not one that is new to Canada or to the city of Montreal, the pandemic has aggravated the issue, further increasing the number of people in precarious situations and putting those already suffering in even more vulnerable situations. I spoke with Leilani Farah, who worked as the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing between 2014 and 2020, and is currently directing her organization The Shift starting 2020. Thank you for speaking to me. So, as you know, my article is about homelessness and the issue of it in Montreal. I know you have a lot of experience regarding this issue in Canada and worldwide due to your work as the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about the work you did while you were working with the UN between 2014 and 2020.
As UN Special Rapporteur, the position is kind of like being a global watchdog. Are governments doing what they're supposed to do under international human rights law to ensure that people have access to and enjoy adequate, affordable, secure housing? And in order to make that assessment, you have to meet with people and understand their living conditions. And you have to meet with governments to hear what they think they're doing, why they think they're ineffective, how they think they've been effective. And of course, we know there's a global housing crisis, and we know that part of the reason for that is that governments haven't done what they should have done to ensure housing is realized as a human right. So I spent 6 years as rapporteur, basically traveling the world and meeting with governments and meeting with people and meeting with other actors as well. It's important to understand that the private sector plays a big role in housing. So I often met with real estate associations and other people involved in the development of housing. And then I also wrote thematic reports. So those were reports that weren't specific to a country, but were more general. So I wrote one on homelessness, for example, and the human right to housing. So there's a huge amount written about homelessness and how to solve homelessness and the causes of homelessness, much less about homelessness as an issue of human rights. And so that was what I wanted to bring to the conversation, to say that homelessness is a prima facie violation of the right to housing. That means no matter what way you slice it, no matter what way you look at it, it is absolutely a violation of the right to housing. And I wanted to expose the ways in which people living in homelessness are discriminated against, treated like criminals, encroachers, occupiers, squatters, and to expose that, in fact, a different way of looking at people living in homelessness, and I think the correct way, is to understand them as people who are just trying to survive They're just trying to live. They're part of the human family. And when they erect a tent on a city street or live on a sidewalk somewhere or in a garbage dump or all the various places I've seen people living in homelessness live, what they're doing is they're claiming their right to housing, in fact. So that report was really early on in my mandate, and I felt it was so important because homelessness is a global phenomenon, and very rarely looked at it as anything but, at best, an issue that charities should be engaged in, and at worst, an issue of criminalization. I wrote other reports that are related to homelessness, actually, that people aren't really talking about. Like, for example, a very popular report I wrote was about the financialization of housing. So that's where investors and corporations used housing as a vehicle for making profit rather than understanding it as a social good. And that has huge implications for homelessness too, because housing is becoming increasingly unaffordable, and unaffordability is directly related to the amounts of homelessness we're seeing around the world. So that gives you a bit of flavor. I did do some Canadian specific things as rapporteur. In 2017, I wrote what we call a communication, which is like it's like a legal letter. I wrote it to the government of Canada saying that I was deeply concerned about homelessness in this country, and that I thought that they could do more, that they needed a national housing strategy based in human rights, that they needed human rights-based legislation that recognizes the right to housing. And I wrote that, and I led on that, and then I had other rapporteurs join me in that. And I'd like to think that that has had an impact on the government. We do now have a national housing strategy that's rights-based, supposedly, and we do have legislation that recognizes the right to housing. And I do hope my communications had something to do with that.
And following your work with the UN, you founded your organization, The Shift. Can you speak a little bit about that and how that's approaching Canadian issues as well?
Sure. So, in fact, The Shift was started while I was rapporteur. I saw pretty early on the need for a shift in paradigm, away from housing as a commodity toward housing as a human right, away from homelessness as a matter of crime or charity toward housing, understanding homelessness as a violation of the right to housing, away from the use of forced evictions as a means of developing housing or improving housing, toward a recognition that forced evictions and evictions into homelessness are a violation of the right to housing. So that I understood early that we needed this shift. I formed a partnership with a body at the United Nations, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So it's the main body responsible for human rights within the UN system, as well as with a network of cities called UCLG, United Cities and Local Governments. And together, the three of us, the trio, launched The Shift. And the idea was really to change the conversation and to change the way in which different actors engage housing. When I was leaving the rapporteurship, it became clear to me that the work was not complete, and we needed to keep up the pressure, and that the idea of this shift was growing in momentum and energy. So we launched The Shift as an organization in 2020. So before it was sort of a concept, and then we launched it as an organization. And the organization, the aim of which is to create a movement around the right to housing, and a global movement around the right to housing. We are, in fact, doing some very Canadian specific work. We have a project called Shift Cities Canada. And the aim of Shift Cities Canada is to work really closely with some cities across the country, big and small. Toronto is one, Victoria is another, Yellowknife, Kitchener, to work very closely with those city governments to help them better understand what the right to housing means under international human rights law and what it could look like if it was rolled out at the local level. So We've been engaged in issues around homelessness, homeless encampments in particular, and what a rights-based approach to homeless encampments would look like. And I developed a protocol specifically for the Canadian context when I was rapporteur that details, how should we engage homeless encampments? How should we understand them from a human rights point of view? So that work in Canada is really groundbreaking. It's the only project of its kind in the world, to my knowledge, where we're working under a memorandum of agreement with the city. So it's not just that we're advocating with the cities. The cities are our partners, and they've agreed to try this framework and this approach, at least for part or some of their housing programs and policies. So we're reviewing all of the bylaws and policies, for example, that each city has to say, well, this could contravene the right to housing if you were to implement it for this reason. For example, the bylaws around sleeping in parks. That may come about as a safety issue. Maybe that's where those trespass bylaws come from. They don't want people to be unsafe and sleep in a park. It could be that they feel that parks are places where, kids play and shouldn't sleep there. Maybe it's, you don't want teenagers camping out. So that could be the reason for those bylaws. But the impact is that when you have a city like Toronto or Montreal, where homeless people don't want to live in shelters, but have no other alternatives, no other opportunities, they end up living in parks. And so the question becomes, well, does that bylaw then violate the right to housing in light of those circumstances of homeless people?
And in light of the pandemic, how do you think that has slowed down progress or affected it?
It's been mixed in a way because the pandemic exposed the global housing crisis that existed before the pandemic. So, obviously when the World Health Organization said that the only prescription they could offer against COVID was to stay home, wash your hands, and physical distance, it suddenly became clear to a lot of governments, oh, shoot, what do we do about people living in homelessness who have no home in which to stay? And so we saw governments around the world, including some governments in Canada, making moves to put people in who are homeless in hotels, for example. So a kind of recognition that maybe homelessness isn't good for human well-being and health, right? That's like a no-brainer, but it took a global pandemic for them to realize that. So there have been some interesting moves that way. And I think there's this opportunity. And the federal government, for example, came up with a new program, the Rapid Housing Initiative, giving money directly to cities who would use that money to quickly develop housing for those most in need. So in that way, like we saw some movement and COVID was good. But governments are on 4-year cycles. And COVID might have caught some of them in the middle of a cycle. And long-term planning seems not to be a strength of government. And so some of the moves have been a bit short-term. Hotels leased until the end of December, for example, in the city of Toronto. They leased hotels, but those leases are ending in December of 2021. So then what happens? Where will people living in homelessness go then? What's the long-term plan? The government announced that as a result of COVID, it announced it was going to end homelessness, chronic homelessness, they said. But they didn't really make sure that cities were equipped to do so. So is Montreal equipped to end homelessness? Does it have the resources and capacity to do so? There seems to be a disconnect between what the federal government says and then what's actually possible at provincial and local level. So COVID has been a mixed bag, in my opinion. I do think some big rethinking is going on. Where, I am hearing conversations like we need a new social contract, global conversations. I'm hearing conversations about the need for economic reform and a new economy. So these are good, but housing often gets left out of those conversations. And in particular, the role that financial actors are playing gets left out of those conversations. And we're using old ideas around housing when we are in a completely new landscape. They're still talking about supply and demand. Some supply has been built, and that certainly hasn't alleviated the housing crisis. And we can't leave it to developers to address our housing crisis. We've left housing to developers for the last 30 years, and we're in the crisis we're in because we've done that, we being governments. So I hear there's a chance for new conversations. And I think we those of us who see housing as central to a new economy, central to a new social contract, we really have to start asserting that and putting that in those conversations.
Thank you, Leilani. That was really insightful commentary, especially coming from someone who has experience working both locally and internationally. Now we'll be hearing from James Hughes, President and CEO of the Old Brewery Mission based in Montreal. So, hello James, welcome. Can you tell us a little bit about the Old Brewery Mission and what work you're in?
So, the Old Brewery Mission is Montreal and Quebec's largest organization serving homeless men and women. We have been around since 1889, so over 130 years old, serving these individuals who find themselves without housing of their own. And today, the Old Brewery Mission has over 300 employees and operates 9 facilities here in the city of Montreal because the issue of homelessness has grown not just in terms of size, but in terms of complexity. And the Old Brewery Mission has had to grow to try to meet those needs. And so we can get into the specifics of what exactly we do, but in a nutshell, our mission is to reduce homelessness. It's an awful thing to be homeless. You never wish it on anybody, but too many people become homeless in Montreal today. At any one time, there's about 4,000 homeless people in the streets and in the shelters. That's an understatement because there's many people we can't count because they're what's called couch surfing. They have no fixed address of their own, but nor are they visibly homeless in a shelter or on the street. So that's our goal is to see the elimination of homelessness, to see it abolished. That is obviously not going very well because the numbers are, as I said, are going up. So we receive people, people come and bang on our door and say, I'm homeless. And we say, okay, come on in. Let's get to know you. Let's try to help you. So we try to calm and stabilize people. That's called l'accueil, or the welcome. We then try to get to know them so that we can accompany them on the journey out of homelessness and into housing. And then we run we'll run over 330 units of housing here in Montreal to provide a platform for people to get out of homelessness, stay out of homelessness. And needless to say, the people we accompany out of emergency, out of the social emergency they're in, they can find themselves in housing anywhere. It doesn't have to be in our housing. The housing markets as such are not properly adapted to people with such extreme needs. So, and who are living in such extreme poverty.
You said that you feel like the issue has grown in both size and complexity in Montreal. Can you expand on what you mean by that exactly?
Well, in terms of growth in the numbers, there's just, more people. There's something called a street count that is done every 3 or so years. And in 2015, the street count showed about a little over 3,000 people who were homeless. In 2018, it showed about 3,150 people who were homeless. And that's a point in time count. So this night, that's how many. So it's not the total number of people over a course of a year who will be homeless. The estimates would be higher than that, around 4,000, 4,500, something like that. So I use the term 4,000. And it's grown since COVID as well. We get to see that by the demand for services. Everything's pretty much full all the time, including the additional services that have been opened in downtown Montreal, the hotels that have been converted into temporary facilities. In the East End, the arenas that have been converted into temporary facilities, they're all full. So we're sensing there's probably an increase between 500 and 1,000 people. And so on that issue, if you got your quantity and your quality, like we're seeing the demand for services of people with addictions, people with mental illness, people who have behavioral issues that make them not easy candidates to get housing, not even easy candidates to get services like in hospitals. It's a community of people that is that has suffered so much. I mean, people who are homeless are homeless for a reason. Most people who have mental illness are not homeless. Most people who have addictions are not homeless. Most people who live in extreme poverty are not homeless. But those that find themselves with that additional challenge of homelessness are really in a rough shape because they've lost everything, right? They've lost their housing, they've lost their income, and they've lost all of their social networks because otherwise they wouldn't be demanding services of the kinds we have. So that's why it's such a tough group to help because none of the other public institutions have been able to help them. So I mean, in many ways, the Old Bury and other organizations like it are the social safety net of the social safety net.
The pandemic has obviously affected the issue of homelessness in many different ways, some even positive, such as the increased awareness to the need to solve this issue. What's your take on both the positive and negative effect that the pandemic has had thus far?
Yeah, I mean, it has raised awareness. It has shown how vulnerable homeless people are. And it was for that reason the Quebec government, based on an advocacy campaign, actually prioritized homeless people for vaccination. So, I think you're absolutely right, or that person is absolutely right, that it has raised the profile of homeless people in terms of their vulnerability. And as I like to say, the best vaccine for homeless people is not Pfizer or Moderna. It's permanent and affordable housing, so that they can protect themselves, lock the door, and just like you and I can, right? They can't do that right now. They live in communal, congregate spaces most of the time, so it makes them very, very vulnerable. So yeah, I mean, it's the downside has been, in particular, the impact on the housing markets. They've just become even more expensive than they were before. They were very difficult to access before, but they've, the market's 4, 5, 6% we're hearing in terms of the rental rates that are going up. And that makes it even farther away for someone who's living in extreme poverty. And it makes it really difficult for someone who's, maybe getting $600 or $700 a month in welfare to try to get an apartment that, maybe used to be $500, but now it's $600 or $650. Like, forget about it, right? They just on their own with that income, they cannot get out. And there's no more, like, this is, one of the problems. The public sector has not boosted funding to make housing more accessible since the pandemic, which it should have. It hasn't. It has not given us the tools to accompany people successfully on that journey out in any meaningful way. So it's a struggle right now. It's a hard time in the sector, I must say.
Thank you so much, James. That was really insightful information to the situation in Montreal and the Old Brewery mission. The last person who will be joining us today in this episode of the podcast is Cécile of Dans la Rue. Hello, Cécile. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd just like to start by asking you if you could tell us a little bit about Dans la Rue and what your missions are as an organization.
In 1993, the bunker opened, and it's a night shelter, an emergency shelter. For now, it's operating for 17 beds, 9 during the pandemics, but 17 officially, with men and women from 12 to 21. We do have a specialty around minors and runaways, so we are open only until 21. And they can stay a few days, but not for long stays for now. So we have intervention workers working with them to understand why they're out and what we can do to help them during the day. So this crisis management and, psychosocial work. a few years later, in 1997, opened the day center, and there we have such psychosocial services. We have meals, showers, clothing depot, material donations, but we do also have programs to help mobilize young people, like music, art, activities, paper day, jobs. We do also have a school there, and well known, Emmett John's School. We do have employability programs. We do also have family services for young women, for young parents, actually. We opened in 2014 housing units in Hochelaga, so 17 units.
Wow, it seems like you provide a real range of activities for youth, and you've been working in your position since 2013. What would you say are the improvements that you've seen in the situation overall in Montreal in the years that you've been working?
Things have changed. We don't have the same population. There are improvements and there are worsenings, actually. Improvements, I would say, we offer a lot of services. So I would say young people would find a place to stay, more or less, a place to eat as well. There is a lot of employment programs, a lot of mental health programs as well. In the 8 years, the big change I see is actually we're aiming or trying to develop more prevention services or prevention lens, which means that it has to go far beyond the homelessness sector. It goes really to, it's a more systemic approach. So we're not quite there yet, but at least the conversation has started, and we have a coalition towards prevention, etc. Young people actually would form like 50% of the adult homeless population. So it's very important actually to address youth homelessness if we want to address adult homelessness and chronic homelessness. And also, young people do experience homelessness very early. In Canada, they say like 40% will experience homelessness before the age of 16. So, and there are ways actually to address that and to turn off the tap. Is that the way we say that? Turn off the tap actually of homelessness, of youth homelessness. So we know also that young people exiting child youth protection actually will experience homelessness quite too often, with like 20% of them will experience homelessness within a year, and another 30% will experience housing instability. So 50% of youth exiting care every year will experience housing instability, a form of housing instability. So there's something we can do. So we are pretty convinced that we can do something and go towards more prevention. It's also in the recent years, Quebec has issued a policy against homelessness. You know about that, probably. So we have action plans, etc. So there is a lot of conversation going on how to address that and how to prevent. And I would say this is one of the biggest improvements. Another one, again, that's something that started a long time ago, but there is a huge awareness around mental health issues for young people, and we were able to start to consolidate a partnership around mental health. So in the downtown Montreal, I would say probably the east part of downtown Montreal, we gathered 20 organization, institution, and community organization to address mental health issues. So early detection is one of the goals, and we're pretty much we did a lot of improvements in that field as well. When I was talking about prevention, I was talking about Quebec and Montreal, etc. But the conversation, I'm involved in many conversations around Canada, and it has started in whole Canada as well. So there is a coalition to prevent, reduce, and end youth homelessness in Canada. There are research projects around that, a lot of them, aiming at early detection, aiming at sustainable exits. So it's, to me, there was a lot of progress.
Thank you so much, Cecile, for joining us and for your insight. Lastly, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And if you'd like to learn more about this topic, please go and check out upstreamjournal.org/homeless to read the article on this topic.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Human Rights Magazine. The podcast is brought to you by the Upstream Journal. I invite you to consider supporting the program and the magazine with a contribution through PayPal as you explore other episodes.